I would submit to you that Kevin is uniquely qualified to talk about this complicated and often misunderstood topic about drug policy and marijuana in particular. Kevin is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, which, despite what you may think, does not automatically qualify him to talk about marijuana. He is a Marshall Scholar. He received both a master's degree and a PhD from Oxford University in social policy. He worked in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, under three presidents, Presidents Clinton, President George H.W. Bush, and the current president, President Barack Obama. From 2009 to 2011, he worked as the senior advisor to the then head of ONDCP, Gil Kurlikowski. Today, Kevin is the director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida and an assistant professor in the College of Medicine, in particular the Department of Psychiatry. He co-founded Project Smart Approaches to Marijuana, shortened Project SAM, with former Congressman Patrick J. Kennedy. He has testified before Congress at the federal and state levels and is certainly a frequent media participant and interviewee. I had the pleasure of meeting Kevin several years ago at one of these national drug policy conferences where we were both speaking. And what struck me about Kevin is that you can't easily put him into a definitional box. His presentation then and his book today comes across as very common sense, very fact-based, and he acknowledges both the benefits and the dangers in various aspects of drug policy. His lectures and this book are chock full of facts, credible studies, and I think you'll find it an enjoyable read. He says in the afterword of his book, quote, "A smart approach on marijuana policy means putting old ideas and biases aside. It starts with recognizing the health problems caused by the drug while shifting emphasis of policy away from either legalization or excessive punishment to one of prevention, education, health care, treatment, and effective criminal justice programs," unquote. In his book, Kevin notes that today's marijuana, for example, is dangerously potent compared to the marijuana from the 1980s, that it contains up to 500 chemical constituents, but that it is not as addictive as tobacco or heroin. He points out that the majority of adolescents and teens who use marijuana don't become dependent on the drug, but that more youth are in treatment for marijuana abuse and dependence than for the use of alcohol and all other drugs combined. He acknowledges marijuana's medicinal properties, but then explains why the so-called medical marijuana industry has turned into, quote-unquote, a sad joke with devastating consequences. He calls it, quote, an affront to the concept of safe and reliable medicine. In no other realm of medicine is smoking considered to be therapeutic, unquote. Using Department of Justice statistics, he debunks the oft-repeated myth that prisons are full of people who are in jail for simple possession of marijuana, showing that a mere 0.1% are actually in prison for first-time possession, and that most of those were pled down from more serious cases. And that's certainly my experience as a prosecutor. I don't remember ever prosecuting somebody for simple possession of marijuana. We would never file those cases. And I've been a prosecutor in California, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. He also notes that only 0.1% of federal prisoners were in for simple possession, and on average, those folks were in possession of 115 pounds of marijuana, which is roughly 156,000 marijuana cigarettes. I think we can all agree that that's a little bit more than you would need for personal use. At the same time, Kevin calls for criminal justice reform, including reforming the way we keep and expunge marijuana arrest records, and he explains and pushes for more drug courts. He explodes the myth that the taxes raised from legalized sales of marijuana will cover or exceed the social burdens and costs of legalization. He does so by analogy. He notes that the annual social costs of alcohol and tobacco are over $400 billion a year, yet we get $15 to $20 billion a year in tax revenue from alcohol and a measly $25 billion a year in tobacco taxes. How could it be any different if we legalized marijuana around the country, is his point. Kevin argues, quote, that America is being sold a false dichotomy, unquote, between sticking with the current policies or outright legalization. Rather, Kevin's book calls for a, quote unquote, smart approach between the extremes of either tough or lenient marijuana laws. That smart balance requires, quote, an honest conversation about marijuana and the science behind today's high-potency product, unquote, and includes reduced use through prevention, new forms of treatment, and smart justice. In short, Kevin says it's time for some reefer sanity. I give you Kevin Sabet.
Thank you, Cully, and I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting this, and Ed and Meese and your work throughout the years on the drug issue has been some work that I've admired. And I want to just thank everyone for coming here today, as you said, on a dreary day. And as I looked at the RSVP list, I was encouraged by the diversity of opinions and the different branches of government and public sector and private sector that are represented here. So I'm very happy about that. I don't blame you, Cully, for going to the Berkeley joke. I do the same thing. In fact, when I was at Berkeley, I started a group called Citizens for a Drug-Free Berkeley, which was about as popular as the Coalition for a Wine-Free France, I think. But it was fun, and we did a lot of things actually around the, at that time in the late 90s, the growing use of synthetic drugs like MDMA and ecstasy, along with marijuana and other issues. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about my book, which came out I think about 6 or 7 months ago, Reefer Sanity. And I also, again, want to thank all of you. Some of you were at the launch in Washington. I have to thank especially one of my mentors who's here, Bob DuPont, the founding director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I thank you for your friendship and your guidance. And I mean, this is the man who essentially convinced Richard Nixon to be the expand treatment in the most dramatic way we had ever seen before or since, and actually was the person who got lawmakers in this city to be concerned with the burgeoning heroin epidemic, especially among prisoners and among D.C. residents, which was no small feat for that administration. So I want to thank you for your work. I have a lot of slides, and I want to make sure I keep some time for Q&A, and I do have a version of this on my website, so I'm going to be going over very quickly. I just put some disclaimers and interests out in the beginning. I do not receive any funding from a U.S. federal or state agency. I serve on the American Society for Addiction Medicine Public Policy Committee. As Cully said, my experience spans partisan administrations. I am vehemently nonpartisan and serve really at the pleasure of folks that are interested in learning more about this issue. And today I'm going to present the work of many collaborators and colleagues from around the country who represent various different groups and medical associations. Just to get us grounded here, I think it's important, given all the talk about marijuana, to just go over, first of all, what substances we use in society. And according to the Health and Human Services survey that comes out once a year, the last one came out basically showing that for every marijuana user, there are 3 to 4 tobacco smokers and 6 to 8 drinkers. Now, the CDC survey shows fewer tobacco smokers, and that looks at a different population, but roughly 18 to 26% of Americans regularly smoke cigarettes, and about 50 to 60% regularly drink. This is defined as at least once in the last 30 days, and marijuana hovers lately between about 7 to 9%. I find that actually particularly striking because I'm not sure if this will work on the screen. A little bit it will. I find it particularly striking because, given all of the efforts against tobacco and the stigma, which I think has been very good for public health, there are still 1 in 4 Americans, or 1 in 5, depending on the survey, smoking. Now, it's true that there are more teens smoking marijuana now, more 12th graders, than smoking cigarettes, and I would attribute that really to the stigma against cigarettes and the fact that I don't even know smokers who like the fact that they smoke. I mean, it's hard to find someone to defend smoking, including among smokers. That certainly isn't the case with marijuana. Smoking has been legal for 100 years, so we know that it's not the legality that's driving the use down of smoking. It's the recent stigma and, in fact, the move towards restrictive policies. You cannot smoke in most places in this country, probably including your own house if you want to keep your marriage or have your kids around you. That is how far we have gone in smoking. And if you contrast that with marijuana today, it's unbelievable to think about the stigma for cigarettes that exist versus the non-stigma for marijuana use, especially among kids. So let's get right into the first myth. Again, I'm going to present a lot of facts and try and go quickly so we can have time for questions. But this first one is the notion that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive. What we know is actually that marijuana can certainly be harmful and it can be addictive like other substances. We know that, for example, the adolescent brain is essentially under construction until about age 28 and 30. In fact, even recent research shows that the last part of the brain in the front that develops, in many people does not develop until even about age 40. And so as a result, we know that when you're a child, it's much easier, for example, to learn a language or learn how to swim or learn to ride a bike, right, when you're 4 versus when you're 40 or 50. That's because your brain picks things up pretty easily. And there's no exception here with any drug of abuse or any kind of drug addiction. When that drug enters the brain, the bloodstream, it's sort of essential ability to hijack that brain and essentially to make you continue to use the substance despite negative consequences, despite maybe a desire to stop. And of course, that is the same with a lot of other addictive behaviors that don't have to do with substances. We know that the adolescent is much more vulnerable. So when we look at marijuana use and we look at 16-year-olds, and this is a study actually that was done in the late 90s. So I would love, and I know we have some reps from the current National Institute on Drug Abuse, I would love some more recent research on with today's marijuana done on the addictiveness. We have basically data from the late 90s now, which shows that 1 in every 6 16-year-olds who try marijuana will at some point in their life become addicted to it. And the number for adults is about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11. And if you look at treatment centers today, and there's some very good data that comes out of HHS on treatment that actually asks people, why are you here? What is the purpose of you coming to treatment? It also asks counselors. Essentially, for adults, marijuana is number 2 to alcohol. And for teens, as was mentioned, for adolescents, marijuana is the number 1 drug, and the number 1 reason people are in treatment, kids are in treatment, above alcohol and all other drugs combined. We know that about 47 to 50% of those people are referred to from the criminal justice system. In other words, they're smoking at school, they're smoking in public, they are then either mandated or somehow coerced to go to treatment, and many of them do. But we know that over half of them are actually there on their own volition. Or the volition or their choice of their parents, and it's a pretty striking number, especially when you hear a lot of the rhetoric today that marijuana is not addictive. And we then have to ask, why are there so many people in treatment who even volunteer to go to treatment as a result of their use? And when I talk about that, I get a lot of parents are surprised because and I talk about this a lot in the book, the experience of many Americans, mainly the baby boomer generation today, and a lot of the people making the decisions, is very, very different, their experience with marijuana than the experience of kids today. And part of that reason is because the potency has increased so dramatically. I mean, we're talking 1 to 3% in the 60s and 70s, and now the average being around 12 to 14%. Of course, if you're a daily marijuana smoker in California or Colorado, you're not smoking 14% marijuana. You're likely smoking much more potent marijuana, but that is really the national average. And just to illustrate I think the generational divide on this, I was recently at a high school, and I don't get to speak at high schools enough as much as I would love to, and I enjoy it because I always learn a lot. And in front of 1,000 kids, and the person who introduced me was sort of trying to be funny and talk about this in a way that was sort of relating to the kids. And she said, well, and she was a woman in her early 60s. She said, kids, you really want to know about. We're going to hear today about the science behind what happens when that roach clip gets passed around at a party. And when she said roach clip, the faces, the kids had it was like they had no idea what she was talking about. It was like she was speaking Chinese or something. They had no clue. And I think they thought that she was talking about, a form of insect extermination or something. And then, of course, one person raised her hand and said, are we going to talk about dabbing? And the woman looked back at the kid like, because she had no idea what he was talking about. That is a perfect representation, I think, of just not only the potency of marijuana changing, but the ways that marijuana has been consumed. And I think a lot of people who are now, who are the baby boomer generation, who might even still smoke occasionally, but certainly smoked throughout the 60s and 70s. Remember, we had the highest rate of marijuana use in the history of the country in the mid to late 70s, much higher even than now. I think a lot of those folks still bring with them that experience when they talk about this. They also still bring with them the experience of a previous era of heavy enforcement. And I talk about that in the book. We did have heavy enforcement in the 50s. We had the Boggs Act. We had many states adopt a mentality that really this is only an issue that should be criminalized. Remember, we did not learn about the health effects of marijuana and the fact that it does bind to the certain receptors in the brain really until about 30 years ago. 20 to 30 years ago. And so this was thought of as something that should be criminalized. There were reports of insanity and things like that, and it drove a lot of legislators to more punitive enforcement. And I talked to folks who lived in Texas in the 70s and served time in local jail or prison for low-level use. And I think a lot of folks still bring that experience with them today, even though today we have a dramatically different legal landscape with regards to marijuana. And I'll talk about that in the further myth, but just illustrating, I think, the generational divide between folks. I think the other thing to look at here on this graph is that we know that marijuana has hundreds of components to it. It's not just one component. It's not morphine. No, it's not one thing. Science knows about 10% of those components. We still don't know about what 90% of those components do. One of the other components is called CBD, and it's been in the news lately. I'm going to go back to it. But essentially, CBD is not psychoactive. It's not what gets you high. That's the THC. CBD has essentially been bred out of modern marijuana. And that's important to remember. And important to remember when we talk about medical as well, because CBD removes the high. And so it makes sense that growers who are, brilliant at their agricultural techniques, and as agricultural techniques have improved, are able to artificially increase THC. And decrease CBD, even though in the natural cannabis plant, all of these things occur naturally in various forms, and there are much higher levels of CBD than there are in the marijuana that's bred today. And in fact, just speaking about the breeding techniques of marijuana today, I was recently in Vermont where I was speaking to some folks, and somebody raised their hand. They say, well, Kevin, I like marijuana because it's natural. It comes from the ground. God put it here. I don't touch meat. I GMO. Every fruit has to be organic. I don't even want to. My cotton shirt is organic cotton, but I'm okay with marijuana. And she was stunned to learn that marijuana is one of the most genetically modified plants we could ever even imagine today. That today's marijuana that kids are smoking. Talk about selective breeding techniques. Talk about different ways and different fertilizers, and by the way, and pesticides and molds that develop in marijuana and are used in order to artificially increase its strength. So again, I think that there's just been such a communication divide between the reality of today's marijuana versus the marijuana that might have been smoked in the 60s, 70s, or even 80s and 90s. One of the reasons why Congressman Kennedy has really devoted a lot of his life to this, and I'm thankful for that and his friendship, and I have to thank him and also David Frum for joining me in this, is the issue of mental illness. And we are learning so much more now, really starting in the mid to late 80s with a landmark study that looked at over 35,000 Swedish conscripts controlled for everything you could imagine, and essentially found a significant increase in a correlation and risk for regular marijuana users with schizophrenia. Now that literature has exploded in terms of the psychosis and to some extent depression and anxiety. I think a lot of folks say, well, is it chicken before the egg? In other words, is it the marijuana that causes mental illness, or is it mental illness that, causes people to quote unquote self-medicate, which self-medication is only a term never a term that I hear researchers and MTs use, but it's a term we've sort of invented in our lexicon. But anyhow, we know what we're talking about when I say self-medicate. And the research actually shows both ways. First of all, if you have a genetic predisposition to mental illness, heavy marijuana smoking increases your chances of getting it. And yes, if you have, if you're suffering mental illness, there are, there's evidence showing that the direction does go the other way as well. So really, the evidence shows that it goes both ways. And to me, that doesn't make me say, well, we need more research to figure out what the link is. To me, that says, well, we know marijuana exacerbates the issue. I mean, that's so for policy, we should understand that if we're concerned about mental illness, and I really do think that mental illness is one of, if not the most silent epidemic that we have today in this country, to totally ignore at least some role that researchers have found that marijuana plays, I think we ignore that to our peril. I'm probably emphasizing too much on the myth one here, but certainly lungs, and I don't need to go into a lot of detail about lungs. If you smoke lettuce, it's bad for your lungs. So you can imagine if you're smoking something that the American Lung Association says has 50 to 70% more carcinogens than tobacco smoke, it's probably also not good for your lungs. The evidence on lung cancer is mixed. There have been different studies, the most recent one by Dr. Tashkin showing no connection. I think that the jury's out. We need to see and not sort of overstate the case, but we need to continue to do the research to see what happens. A lot of times it's very difficult to separate out the tobacco smokers with the marijuana smokers in many of these studies, so it's difficult to find that. Remember, we only learned about the tobacco and lung cancer connection. Actually, we learned about it 80 or 90 years ago, not 50 years ago as people think, but that did take some time to develop as well. We'll see if we end up going there or not with that. If I had to point to one study in the last 25 years on marijuana that I think has the most impacts for society and for us as a country and as a nation competing in an ever more competitive global marketplace, it would be the one that was done among over 1,000 people. In other words, every single person born in 2 years in the fourth largest city in New Zealand has been followed for their whole life. That's born in 71 and 72. So they've been followed by researchers for 40 plus years. Essentially what they found the last time they checked in with these folks, that was a couple years ago, they were 38 by then. What they found out was among heavy persistent marijuana smokers that there was a significant risk for about a 6 to 8 point reduction in IQ if they had started when they were young, and that held even if they stopped when they were an adult. But by age 38, that could be seen. Researchers went back after being challenged. In fact, they were shocked at this. They went back and made sure they controlled for all socioeconomic factors. They made sure they controlled for alcohol. In fact, alcohol did not show as big of a reduction in IQ. It did show some, but it didn't show as big. And even when controlling for that confounder of alcohol and other drugs, this 6 to 8 point connection was still seen. And I talk about this a lot at schools and with teachers, and I inevitably get somebody in the audience says, well, Kevin, our last 3 presidents smoked marijuana, and they're smart. Steve Jobs, I just saw the movie Jobs. He certainly did a lot of drugs and a lot of marijuana, and he's responsible for for all the wonders of technology today. How why are you implying that if you smoke pot you're just instantly going to be dumb? And that's not what the study is implying, and it's certainly not what I'm implying. But the point is, it's a risk, and it's a risk that kids have to be able to understand, and I think our country should understand. Certainly, if you are a genius and you have 150 IQ or 160 and you lose 8 points, you probably won't miss it. Steve Jobs, we didn't miss it. I don't, I think Apple products are great. I don't get paid by them for say that or anything, but I like them. I have my iPhone here. Wonderful. He was able to do that and get away with it. Great. We're all better for it. But the problem is, and I know parents have a hard time sort of understanding this or coming to grips that not every child is a genius. Right? There's a reason why we have a term average. Average means what is the average of all kids? And when you look at, depending on class and where you are, but if the average is about 100, 8 points knocked off of 100 is a big deal. That is a big deal. You will miss some stuff as a result. I mean, that is the difference between a job promotion or not. That is the difference between completing a degree in a certain subject that you wanted or not. It is a difference between regularly going to class or dropping out, and the research on school dropouts is also fascinating. So I think that as a country, and as we're basically telling kids right now, as David Frum has pointed out, we're telling today's generation that they have the worst chances of getting a job in 70 years in American history, given our economy. The chances of keeping and remaining in a marriage and having a stable family life is the worst it has ever been in the history of this country. The chances of having healthy children and a stable life with your child and a successful child is the worst it has ever been in any generation. But now we're essentially saying, but we're going to make sure you have good access to marijuana and widely commercialize it. I think we really need to think about the kind of country we're creating when we say that, and we add that onto the other drugs and other problems we have, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Smoked marijuana is medicine, the myth too. I mean, the bottom line with the issue of medical marijuana is it is true. Marijuana does contain medical properties, but we do not need to smoke it to get those properties. Nor do we need to vaporize the raw material, the crude plant to get those properties. Just like we don't smoke opium to get the effect of morphine. What we've ended up doing with that is saying, okay, well, let's figure out what in this plant works. Let's isolate that, and it could be a few components together, it could be one or whatever. Let's put that into a delivery system that makes sense, which smoking does not make sense, as you pointed out, for medicine. We don't smoke any other medicine. And I know this sounds crazy, let's put it in a pharmacy so that a doctor can prescribe it. I don't think that is so crazy, the fact that we would treat marijuana like every other medicine. So if it's medicine, great. Put it in a pharmacy, have doctors prescribe it, and put it in a form that you can take that's safe, and we understand the dose. And you don't dose anything that's smoked. You can't dose crude smoked marijuana. But you can dose components of that. We thankfully live in a scientific age where we know how to extract the components of a plant, or the whole plant even. In fact, we have a drug that has extracted the whole plant, and has put it basically in a dose, which smoking doesn't do, and has put it in a mouth spray. In fact, we just learned 2 days ago that this has been fast-tracked by the FDA in order to treat neuropathic cancer pain. And today, you can enroll, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, God forbid you're suffering intractable cancer pain or intractable spasticity due to multiple sclerosis, there's open enrollment today for that drug, and that's been the case for the last 5 years. There are other drugs that are in the pharmacy already that base themselves off marijuana. I won't talk about those today, Marinol, et cetera. And the question for policy is, do medical marijuana policies increase adolescent marijuana use? I think is something that policymakers talk about. First of all, to answer that, we have to realize that not all medical marijuana states are alike. So California and Colorado are not New Mexico and Rhode Island. They're not Illinois, which barely even has a program. Washington State, which has a sort of, I would say, medium to large, robust program, is certainly not a state like Maryland, which barely has anything that's even started other than an affirmative defense. So when you have studies, you need to make this crucial distinction between states that have these mature programs, or I would say reckless programs that have storefronts and dispensaries and advertising, versus states that don't. And the literature essentially says when that distinction is made, and this is what Rosalie Pakula and her colleagues, this is what Rand has basically come out with, when that distinction is made, use does seem to go up and problems go up. When that distinction is not made, there's no difference between use levels. It also depends on the data set you use. There was a study that got a lot of headlines last week that said medical marijuana does not increase youth drug use. That was interesting. Got to look at what the study said. Well, the study didn't look at Colorado, California, Washington, any of the states that actually the largest states. Look at it, and it wasn't. I'm not saying it was a malicious point on the part of the researchers. The data set they used, the YRBS, does not look at those states for the years that they wanted to look at. So the data set they used, which was a CDC data set that's, I would argue, very incomplete because it's every 2 years and it asks different things in different states. But that data set essentially, when they looked at a state like Rhode Island, or they looked at a state, some of the other states they looked at didn't show a difference. Well, that's not surprising. You can't study global vodka consumption and look at a data set that omits Russia. I mean, it just doesn't. You would miss a lot, and that I think is something that's happened. Myth 3. Let's talk about the people behind bars. Just the premise of this. Most of the opinion polling that's talking about marijuana. what people have found when you sort of dig deeper, and it's true that about, depending on what poll you use, you could say 54% or so of Americans agree with legalizing in some way marijuana, not medical, but recreational. When you dig deeper into that public opinion, what you often find is not an overwhelming exuberance about marijuana. It's not that 54% of people are just really gung-ho about a lot of people smoking pot. And it makes sense that it wouldn't be that, given that we only have 7 to 9% of Americans that regularly smoke pot. So, where is that disconnect? What we've seen is that it's more of a dissatisfaction with what is perceived as a war on drugs that is throwing people in prison. And by the way, the term war on drugs by a drug czar has not been used since, basically, I think in the early 90s. Bill Clinton in 1992 and 93 said, we're not going to use it. John Walters did not use that term. But anyhow, this perception that we throw everybody in prison for marijuana, because baby boomers lived through that. A lot of them did. If you had long hair and had a joint in your pocket and lived in Dallas in 1973, God help you. I get it. So that perception is brought to today. And when you actually, first of all, let's look at the situation. 12 states plus decriminalized the possession of marijuana throughout the 1970s. In fact, that was the last time we were moving very closely towards legalization. And I have another talk that talks about why everyone thought it was inevitable, legalization, in 1977. And by 1981, if you thought legalization was going to happen in the next couple of years, you would be laughed out of a room. The change in a period of 4 to 5 years was dramatic in that. But anyway, in the 70s, 12 plus states decriminalized. And what a lot of researchers, including a professor of mine at Berkeley, who I don't agree with on a lot of marijuana policy, but I in terms of his conclusions, but his analysis is very good, essentially found that the term decriminalization had very little real world significance. What do I mean? Well, what he's found is actually states that technically didn't decriminalize in the 70s often had harsher laws, or didn't have harsher laws than states that had decriminalized. In other words, you had a state that should have had fewer penalties that was decriminalized. But in reality, when you looked at who was arrested, who actually was spending a night in jail, et cetera, those states seem to have sometimes harsher policies that actually had the label of decriminalized. As I mentioned, this isn't very surprising. Medical marijuana suffers from the same, generic problem that these laws are heterogeneous. So decriminalized, I think we have to be very careful with that term. But at the end of the day, and I looked at this when I was, a bunch of people looked at it in the Clinton, Obama, and Bush administrations, basically found that our state and federal prisons are not full of people whose only crime is smoking marijuana. And that is a shocking statement to make, given the perception. But is totally uncontroversial in criminal justice circles and people that at the Bureau of Justice Statistics and others that actually look at state and federal prison. As Cully mentioned, we're talking 0.1% of marijuana-only possession. No priors is about 0.4 or less. Many of those people pled down. That's even why that is recorded in there. These are folks, some of whom it's like you're driving over the speed limit, you get pulled over, you haven't registered your car in 3 years, you might have a warrant out for your arrest, and yes, there's marijuana paraphernalia in your car and a joint in your pocket. Yes, then it will be seen as marijuana. And sometimes when those arrests, they only look at the most severe arrest, or the severe thing that you're doing, and let's say the speeding or the paraphernalia was more severe, that often gets dropped for various reasons in the criminal justice system, and what's left is the marijuana possession arrest. Now, the number is, and this I think some folks might be thinking about this, the number is unclear for local jails. Remember, there are 3 jurisdictions you could be locked up in this country: your local jail, your state or federal prison. We don't have good local jail numbers. New York City certainly made it a point to arrest people with low levels of marijuana, with smoking marijuana in public. This was the point of the broken windows sort of policing that Rudy Giuliani brought in and was later continued for really until very recently. And so New York, certainly there was an exception to that. I did my dissertation in New York about New York, and I looked at, certainly people were spending between 12 and 24 hours in a New York City jail if they were publicly smoking marijuana. That was happening there. We know that we have over 750,000 arrests yearly. for marijuana possession. Now, these are reported by different police departments who have different methods of reporting. And an arrest, of course, can mean a civil citation. It can mean a warning. It can mean a appearance before a judge where you get your hand slapped and you go on your way. It could mean that you have to do some kind of brief counseling, although that's not really that common. When Rand looked at this, they basically said that for every joint smoked, your chance of being arrested was 1 in 12,000. And that was arrest, not incarceration. Now, I am not downplaying the negative consequences of an arrest. Okay, I don't think anybody wants to be arrested that's in here. It's not just, it's all the same to me, and what's the big deal about an arrest? No. An arrest is an unpleasant experience. It can hurt your chances for getting a job in the future. You have that on your record. And you can be discriminated against for various public public assistance, et cetera. I'm going to get to sort of what I think should happen as a result, but I want to make it clear that I'm not downplaying the arrest issue. And I will get back to it. Let's get to this fourth myth, which is really the crux of it. And this is this issue that the legality of alcohol and tobacco strengthen the case for marijuana legalization. I think it does the exact opposite. It actually perfectly makes the case why we wouldn't want to legalize marijuana, a third addictive substance. First of all, we know, and John Calkins and others have looked at this, that 20% of all people who smoke marijuana consume about 70 to 80% of the marijuana consumed. Okay, so it's a small number of users of all that using class who consumes the vast majority. This is the same thing with alcohol, right? It's why most people drink responsibly, but 20% of people that don't drink responsibly cause a lot of problems in society. It's about the same thing with marijuana today. And when I look at alcohol or tobacco as a model, I see these are two substances that have far greater prevalence than any of our illegal drugs. So that means that something about the law and culture is working, that we don't, when something is a little bit more difficult to get or it's more risky to get, that society uses less of it. But I think most importantly, my issue with legalization is the fact that we're talking about industries that promote addiction and then essentially have to target kids in order to do that. Raise your hand in here if you know somebody who's a drug addict or alcoholic who started using their drug of choice when they were an adult. Now, I usually have like one or two people that raise their hand because of the prescription drug crisis, people who never used, and then they were, had a bad shoulder, and they got 100 OxyContins, and they got addicted when they were 35. That certainly has happened. But nobody in here, and the vast majority of people, this is borne out in the statistics, if you are addicted to a drug, that of course includes alcohol and tobacco, there is a 99% chance that you started when you were a child. Now, what does that mean? That means that industries, because they need lifelong customers, have to target kids. They have to target young people. That is part of the playbook if you want to make any money in this business. Remember, the alcohol and tobacco industries do not make money off of the person who drinks a few beers on the weekend, or a glass of wine with dinner, or one cigarette on their birthday. These industries make money from heavy users, from that small number of people who use recklessly and irresponsibly and hurt their family and their life and their future as a result. So my problem with marijuana is this. It's essentially the idea of creating the next tobacco industry of our time. Okay, if we were talking about, I did go to Berkeley and I made friends, a lot of residents there that were there during the, magnificent times of the free speech movement and all this stuff. If legalization was about letting a lot of those ex-hippies smoke a joint once a week or once a day or twice a day in the privacy of their own home, and that's all that it was about, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it, as long as I didn't get in a car or, to care of my kids, but they're not doing that. They're retired. I wouldn't have as much of a problem with that. But that is not what legalization is about, because you can't have an industry that just makes money off of casual users. That doesn't happen. You have to encourage heavy use. You have to encourage reckless and dangerous use. And so this is what I worry about. I worry about this idea of big marijuana with regards to legalization. When I see today in the Denver Post, by the way, the Denver Post has a whole section on marijuana with ads and all the revenue they're getting and all the different strains of marijuana and how wonderful they are and all of that. When I look at that, and I look at it every day, and I see a new kind of pre-rolled marijuana cigarette that is coming out imminently, that is going to be advertised. And by the way, next to it, you can find a store near you with your town and zip code. When I see that kind of promotion and advertising, when I see the edibles that are essentially out there that, I'm sorry, nobody can tell the difference between regular Nutella and Nutella with marijuana unless you ingest it. So nobody in here can, let alone your 5-year-old. When I see advertisements that talk about a $1 joint after you show your ski pass, that's what I worry about. And actually, Patrick was on the Colbert Report, and he talked about this. We got a lot of emails from people saying, that can't exist, that's no way, and that's not what this is about, that must be fake. Well, we produced the ad, here it is, here's the coupon. It is real. When I look at the cartoon advertising, the edibles, the sodas, and remember, these sodas, by the way, were developed under the medical marijuana regime, because, all the 85-year-old people with 4-stage cancer, what they really want is a grape soda with a marijuana monkey on the front of it. Right, that's what we want as your medicine. But this is what I'm worried about. When I look at the vaporizing industry, if you want to study something and you're interested in this, and you want to look at the cutting edge, you look into the e-cigarette business right now, and how the blending of the marijuana cigarettes and the e-cigarettes. When I look at Japan Tobacco International, the 3rd largest tobacco conglomerate in the world, now buying a portion of the hottest, most up and coming vaporization, e-cigarette, m-cigarette tool. I worry about that. I worry about Japan Tobacco International getting involved in e-cigarettes with regards to marijuana. I worry about the concentrates. If you were to talk about marijuana with a concentrate of 95% purity 10 years ago in a scientific gathering, you would have been laughed out of the room. You can't smoke a 95% THC cigarette. It's unstable. It's impossible to breathe that. But you can extract it through a butane hash oil method and have a wax that you end up combusting and inhaling. And that is what's happening. That is why, and I'm going to talk about some of the data in Colorado, we're seeing things that are extremely dangerous. When I see Groupon getting involved in m-cigarettes and, the dry herb wax and oil vaporizer kit, now, they're never going to use the word marijuana. They wouldn't do that. It's just oftentimes when you debate this issue, you never hear the word legalization or commercialization. You only hear the word regulation, because that sits a lot better. Same thing. You're not going to hear marijuana from Groupon, but you are going to hear dry herb wax and oil vaporizers. And I don't think they're talking about tobacco. So these are increasingly popular and accessible. I worry about the intersection between marijuana and Wall Street. I mean, this is a reality. The reality is, and you can look it up yourself, there are many private holding groups, multi-million-dollar investing companies funding and raising money in order to make a lot of money in this industry. And they're right. There is a lot of money to be made. I mean, they should do it. Because if we're going to go down this path, this is exactly what's going to happen. There's a group, Joint Industries, that says if you had invested $100 in a cannabis company only 3 months ago, this is what your investment might look like in February. And so whether this is true or not doesn't matter. The point is it's enticing people to get involved in this. It's showing that this is about money. This is not about the counterculture in the 1960s anymore. And how ironic I think it is that the values of the hippie movement, which were anti-business, or anti-big money, let's put it that way, are now being ushered in with the Wall Street movement in marijuana. I think that's unbelievable when you think of the irony there and how these laws, and if you even look at the lobbying groups in this city that it started 40 years ago, were because of reducing arrests and not putting people in prison and letting people smoke in the privacy of their own home. And now we're talking about big money and different investment groups and CNBC and Medbox Inc., which is, by the way, a company that invests in vending machines, these vending machines here. And when you see Fortune magazine talking about Marijuana Inc., and you look at the tobacco industry papers, and you see that the tobacco industry themselves 35, 40 years ago actually have a plan to get into the marijuana industry. This is really what I worry about. My next book that I'm currently researching looks at the tobacco industry and the history of the tobacco industry and the many methods of lying that they employed for 100 years. And it compares, basically it matches that to the current marijuana industry. And what I'm seeing is scary because it's really planting the seeds of this new industry. And if you want some, anybody can access these papers. These are the confidential papers of the tobacco industry that they wrote amongst themselves when they thought nobody was looking. And if you want some, good bedside reading, you want your stomach to turn, actually, before you go to bed, you should read these, especially if you're a parent. And you start hearing about what they were doing to target youth and how they were testifying in front of Congress. No, sir, this is only about adults to use in the privacy of their own home. Those arguments sound very familiar today when I look at the advertisements during the legalization campaigns. I'm not going to dwell on that, but essentially that's what I worry about. I won't talk a lot about this, but the issue of, I'm not saying that current policy is perfect. I'm not saying that prohibition is something that we should all embrace. That's wonderful. All policies have trade-offs. The point is, which trade-offs are you willing to live with? And I think that we will be much worse off as a country if we go down this route. It doesn't mean that I think the underground market is a great thing. No. But the underground market doesn't get most of its revenue from marijuana. So the idea that they're even going to go away under legalization, that you're even going to have that happen at least, I think is very, very far-fetched. Because these transnational criminal groups are making their money off of human trafficking, internet crimes now, identity theft, and expensive drugs like cocaine or heroin. Trust me, we can make much better marijuana right here in the good old US of A. We don't need to import it from Mexico. And these groups that are in the other countries are making their money from many, many other things. As Cully mentioned, we're not going to make money as a society off of these drugs. Many of us live in states with the lottery. The lottery, right? The lottery was in order to solve the public education crisis. How's that going? Problem solved? Now we're just promised something else. Alcohol, and in fact, the reason why the big industrialists, you should read a book called Last Call about alcohol prohibition. The big industrialists came around and supported the repeal of prohibition because they thought we would no longer need a federal income tax if we could regulate and tax alcohol. That's not really working out so well when you look at the numbers. For every $1 in alcohol and tobacco tax, it costs us 10 in social costs. By the way, we arrest 3 times as many people for alcohol, nonviolent alcohol offenses than all marijuana offenses. So if you even want to reduce the criminal justice system involvement, I want to get cops out of here, I don't want them in my life, get rid of law enforcement. Well, you wouldn't want to treat marijuana like the drug that is the #1 substance that law enforcement spends its time on. Especially when you have to now train all these officers on training with regards to marijuana public intoxication, marijuana and driving. You're going to need more regulation and enforcement. Not less if those numbers reach anywhere near alcohol numbers. And I think if it's legal over time, those numbers will get there, just like with alcohol it did. I'm not going to talk too much about myth 6 and 7, 6 being the European examples. Maybe we can talk a little bit other than really the lesson here is that we are going so much further than any other European country has ever gone with regards to marijuana. It's not like we're mimicking the Netherlands and we can say, well, things were great in the Netherlands and now, no. We are going so much further than they ever did. In fact, and in the Netherlands, which has a de facto legalization, not even one on paper, they're actually closing down marijuana stores. They're pushing back. Now you have to have this weed pass in order to, well, although many stores are violating that, but which means that you are a resident of the Netherlands to go into many of these shops. So as they're sort of not going to that area, we are going to another area. And I won't talk about Uruguay because there's not enough time other than to say Uruguay has a very different model for what they propose to do, which we'll see if it gets off the ground later this year. Myth 7, prevention, etc. Treatment doesn't work, so I try. I'm not going to really dwell into that. I go into a lot of interventions. I just want to go through the last few slides very, very quickly, but really the question is, how did we get where we are with marijuana today? Well, we know 40 years ago the marijuana movement said they will use medical marijuana as a red herring to give marijuana a good name. And I got to say, I got to hand it to them. I mean, been a brilliant PR strategy. It's brilliant, wonderful. I mean, it's been great because what they said, as was recently talked about in the New Yorker, was we were going to give Americans a choice. We were going to ask them, which is worse, drug abuse or cancer? And we bet that they were going to choose cancer's worse. And they did. Because the way medical marijuana has been, which is what started all this, it started with talking about the cancer patient, the person up there. In reality, medical marijuana serves the majority of which are 30s, white males in their 30s and 40s, with a history of drug abuse and no history of cancer, AIDS, glaucoma, MS, Crohn's, ALS, on and on and on. In fact, less than 2% of people with cards are reporting that. But it has been brilliant. Now, we can follow the money. This really, if you look at the support in red and the money spent, I mean, they've spent a lot of money. I mean, upwards of $160 or so million in the last 40 years. And now here we are at legalization support with the red on the left of around 54% or so. That wasn't happening when some of these early groups got into the game. But when you start to control the message and have that megaphone, it's very helpful. So what are we facing in 2014? We're facing a growing inevitability narrative, a narrative that this is going to happen whether you like it or not. And now when I do debates, the only talking point used by the other side is this is inevitable. So you better get on the bandwagon, or you're just, you're with those guys that deny, that think that Earth is flat. I mean, this is going to happen. Which I don't agree with. There's a big money divide. And the third thing is, Colorado and Washington will take a long time to analyze. We're not going to know the impacts, although we have early indications, which I'm not going to go into because of time. But we have early indications, given that they de facto legalized 5 years ago, that things are not going well in Colorado. But states are going to take a while to analyze. And the issue is legalization groups, and I got to hand it to them, this is a smart strategy, they're going as fast as they can to legalize. This isn't like they're saying, well, we're going to see what happens in Colorado, we're going to wait 5 years and then fund California, and 10 years later, after, because it's such a big state, we're going to then go to the East Coast. No, this is happening at a record pace in order to further this inevitability narrative. These are the states that are targeted, and right now, you got to look at Colorado. I will leave these slides. I won't talk about them because I do want to leave at least 7 minutes because I think we're here till 12:30, right? Leave 7 minutes for questions. But we've got to look at Colorado in its broader context. It did not legalize overnight. It actually de facto legalized in the mid-2000s through its medical program. And right now, there's some new research that's just in publication that's going to show that that has not gone well there at all, with regards to traffic fatalities, with regards to kids in treatment, with regards to childhood hospitalizations, with regards to distribution to minors, with regards to kids that are already in treatment that are getting medical marijuana, with regards to teen marijuana use. This is all in publication right now. With regards to car crashes, as I mentioned, traffic fatalities there versus in other places, things are not going well at all. None of this was discussed during the campaign because the folks with the money, that wasn't going to be the message out there. So we're actually tracking this on a website, legalizationviolations.com. We're tracking all of this, and I want to end there in order to be able to take questions. So thank you very much for listening to me today. Thank you.
Well, folks, we have a rich tradition at Heritage of a thoughtful question and answer period. It starts with some simple rules. You identify yourself and your organization, and then you actually ask a question instead of speechify. You can speechify out in the front sidewalk. You can ask a question here. You made a point in your book, Kevin, that I thought might answer some of the questions folks had, and it's not something you touched on. It's on your Myth 4, page 117. You asked the question, do you ever wonder why liquor stores tend to be located more densely in poor neighborhoods than in well-to-do suburbs? Why are lottery dispensers easily found in the economically depressed areas of East LA but rarely seen in Beverly Hills? And then you make this point, I want to see if you can put some more words around it. We hear constantly about this wage gap. There's this war going on to, I guess, somehow narrow the difference between rich and poor. And you say marijuana legalization would widen the gap between the rich and poor even more. Yeah. Explain.
Well, I mean, the issue is, look at, and I'll just go to this last slide so you can see all the contact information. Look at liquor stores, exactly. There are 8 times as many liquor stores in the bad parts of Baltimore than in the upper class parts of Baltimore. That's the case throughout the country. And there's a reason for that. It's not because people in rich neighborhoods don't like to drink. It's because the folks in poorer neighborhoods don't have the resources to write the $50,000 check to the Betty Ford Treatment Center if something goes wrong. They don't have the school and family and healthcare access and other resources to fall back on if things are going astray. And these industries have to prey on those that are the most vulnerable. And that is why actually it's funny, when I come to D.C. and I talk about this, I'm a villain in Northwest, not at Heritage, I'm not a villain, but in most other places in Northwest D.C., villainized. When I go down to Southeast and talk at the community center in Anacostia or the hospital, I'm a hero. These folks living in those neighborhoods do not want to see more drugs in their community. They want to see less drugs. And they're not going to see less stores and fewer drugs when it's legalized and the access and availability goes up. That doesn't mean that we ignore racial injustices with regards to current drug policy. Yes, with regards to probably all criminal or most criminal offenses, we do know that there is a disproportional representation of African Americans and Latinos, especially young men. That would be widened. It would be made worse under a regime where there are more drugs available. Because, by the way, you're still going to enforce the law. When you look at alcohol offenses, again, 3 times as many as marijuana, well, who do those fall on? of course they fall in those communities. So you're going to make those problems much worse, as opposed to dealing with the core issues of why there's disproportionate representation. And I applaud a lot of the things, and not everyone will agree with me here, and maybe Cully won't, but I applaud a lot of the things that the administration has done to reduce, to look at expungements, to reduce mandatory minimums. In the Bush administration, by the way, we also looked at that very closely. And as a candidate and even as president, George W. Bush talked about reducing those mandatory minimums. And many people did in Congress as well. I think that's good. It's a bipartisan effort. Those efforts should be commended. And the point is, and it goes back to just this real quick, and back to the organization that I started with Patrick and David, is that we do not have to legalize in order to fix the things we don't like about the current system. Because I would argue it would make things worse, and in 100 years we'd be sitting here saying, how the heck do we try and reverse this industry? And we're not going to have a prayer in the world to do that. I don't think anybody can reasonably say, given all the problems with smoking, that we can prohibit tobacco tomorrow. It's not going to happen. That industry is far too powerful. So if things go badly, this will be irreversible. And then that is why we're trying to sort of raise the alarm bells on this. And I'll leave you to read the 4 pillars of our organization.
We at Heritage have aligned with the National Criminal Defense Attorneys and ACLU in our overcriminalization project, which is very important. And we've also been calling for smart sentencing reform with groups that you wouldn't traditionally associate with Heritage. We're all of one mind in this particular area. First question in the front row. Please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question.
My name is Paula Gordon, and is this on?
It is.
I have a website called GordonDrugAbusePrevention.com. My question is, if Sam were given a huge amount of resources, what would be the 5 or 6 things that you would do to reverse the pro-legalization efforts throughout the country?
Great question. Well, the first thing I do is go out and celebrate, because we are an all-volunteer organization that has relied on essentially 150 people to donate. The highest personal donor has donated $2,000, and the rest are below that. So we're certainly in want of resources. But one of the things we're going to do, resources or not, this year, that is a priority, is to actually map out, well, what is this third way that we talk about? Okay, if you don't like legalization and you don't like the status quo, well, what do you propose? And I think a lot of state legislatures are hungry for that. And so we plan to do that, and we want to get opinions from a diverse set of viewpoints, even those folks we may not agree with on the legalization question, but that is certainly something. I think the other thing we would do is try and bridge the divide between the public misunderstanding of marijuana and harms and the scientific understanding. I mean, I just wish that the American public, or even a national network, would televise the proceedings of the American Medical Association when they talk about this, or the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the American Society of Addiction Medicine, who all agree with Sam on this, on legalization. I wish that those things could be out there more, and that's why with Sam, we started it not to just be folks in D.C. talking about this, and rather to be those folks, and we were able to recruit a robust medical sort of scientific board, so that and give those voices a platform, because research shouldn't just be discussed in academic circles, and through letters that 10 people read in a peer-reviewed journal. That they need to be out there to influence policy. So that, I don't know if I have time for 5 things, but those are 2 things that certainly we would work on, try and boosting, and frankly, watch and reverse this industry, because nobody's watching the industry right now, and they should be.
My name is.
It's on.
My name is Joel Mandelman. I'm an attorney who does a lot of work with the foundation. My impression, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of the people who are the most vehemently opposed to cigarette smoking and would outlaw it tomorrow if they thought they could get away with it are the same kinds of people, if not the same people, who are in favor of legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana. There's a logical disconnect there that I can't explain. I was wondering if you had any observations.
A lot of folks that I think are the most vehement anti-alcohol or anti-smoking and want to bring, for example, alcohol and tobacco into the drug control conventions in the UN and think it should be equivalent. It's true. A lot of those researchers especially want to bring marijuana out and those in. I wouldn't say a lot, but there are a few. I actually have to say that, you know, a lot of the folks that fought the tobacco industry, that tried for 40 years, successfully after 40 years, of getting vending machines out of sight, that restricted the advertising, which, by the way, the restriction on advertising was only done not because it was really a law, it was done because there was a gun put to the tobacco industry's head that said, we're either going to prohibit you or you're going to stop advertising to kids. And they said, okay, no, well, don't prohibit us. We'll write you a $10 billion check that you can spend on prevention, and we'll go to Southeast Asia and do what we're doing. And if anyone's been to Indonesia, China, Ghana, or other parts, you will see the same ads here recycled. They're 40 years later for a new population, but that's another story. The point is, I think a lot of those folks, though, those advocates who have lived through it, actually don't want to see another marijuana industry. They've aligned with us. Many of our affiliates are those anti-tobacco folks. But I do think some people have that dissonance. You know, tobacco and alcohol, those are so much worse. I got to just vignette. I recently was in the green room waiting to go on a show, and Rosie O'Donnell walks in, you know, the comedian. And she says, well, what are you doing here? Well, who are you and what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm talking about marijuana, whatever. I was a little starstruck. And then she said, yeah, that's interesting about legalization. Well, but, you know, alcohol is so much worse, and it's legal. I have got, you know, my family, alcoholism, and all these horrible things with alcohol, and it's so much worse, and yet it's legal. And it's available, and it's advertised. And I looked at her, and I said, precisely. And then she got it. She said, oh, I see. You don't want to repeat that. But that point needed to be made. The dots needed to be connected. Because I think a lot of people think there's such a dissonance between, and, you know, there's a imbalance that doesn't make sense to them between our alcohol policy. And what I would say is alcohol has been part of widespread Western culture for over 7,000 years. Unlike marijuana, that has been around for probably 2,300 years, maybe longer, but not anywhere near the mainstream fashion in Western culture like alcohol. So it's really hard to make that comparison other than to say, look at alcohol and tobacco today, two of the biggest killers of preventative deaths that we have. Why would we repeat that model for anything? It just happens to be marijuana we're talking about. We could be talking about anything else.
Question here, and then we'll end with one more question.
You indicated that the public health and safety consequences of marijuana, of alcohol and tobacco are about 10 times more than we collect in tax revenue, and that the same might be true for marijuana. Given that the addiction rates and public health costs per user for marijuana are lower than for cigarettes, and that, as your colleague Patrick Kennedy had said, alcohol is more dangerous than marijuana, might that calculus be a little bit different than the same 10-to-1 ratio?
No, I'm not saying it could be very different than 10-to-1. It could be 5-to-1. It could be 20-to-1. My point is, it's not we don't, you know, we wouldn't want to, the costs are going to outweigh the benefits. And in terms of this issue of alcohol versus marijuana, which is what he was talking about and others, there are different substances. I mean, if you got to look at the specific harms to talk about what is technically worse. I mean, alcohol in the liver, you know, when it comes to liver, yeah, of course alcohol is worse. When it comes to lungs, well, marijuana is worse. When it comes to IQ, marijuana is worse. When it comes to violence, alcohol is worse. When it comes to driving, well, marijuana doubles your risk of a car crash and alcohol triples it. Both are bad. I mean, so, you know, I think that this conversation about alcohol versus marijuana has been misguided because, again, when I look at alcohol, and by the way, the addictive rate for alcohol is the same as for marijuana. About 15 to 17% of teens who try alcohol or try marijuana will become addicted, and the number for adults is the same, about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 if you start later. Tobacco is worse than heroin. With regards to an addictive rate, and with regards to overall cost to society, because 0.1% of Americans barely even registers that has used heroin in the last month versus the last year, et cetera, whereas 25% have smoked tobacco, and the addiction rate for tobacco is 1 in 4, and for heroin it's probably between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5. That's not a reason to legalize heroin, because you know, tobacco happens to also be legal. That's a reason to say we don't want to replicate these two things. I know that's where we disagree, but that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Last question here.
Hi, my name is Erin Montgomery. I'm press secretary to Congressman Andy Harris. He's a big fan of you and your organization. I just wanted to point out one slide that you had. You said that neither Holland nor Portugal have legalized any drug, which is true, but Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. And the congressman there's one particular television anchor who has interviewed him, and she's always citing Portugal. Well, look at this study. This study says that, you know, the rate of HIV and AIDS is down, and there are less people being arrested or.
Right.
They cite all these positive effects.
Yeah.
How would you respond to her?
You know,
when
it's
she cites that?
it's amazing to me, and I gotta congratulate Glenn Greenwald and the PR folks at Cato for making this a international story for the last 15 years that sort of won't go away, because they did a brilliant job doing this, and getting this word out. You know, the idea that we're looking at a country of 3 million Catholics and comparing it to the United States, first of all, is something that I just think is interesting when we look at a very different cultural background and history with drugs. But more importantly, in all seriousness, Portugal, yeah, they did not legalize drugs, and they did what they really did. I don't even classify it as decrim. And one of the reasons I don't like the term decrim is because no one understands what it means. It means a million things to a million people. The media uses it interchangeably with legalization, so you can never get a real definition. But what I would say is that in Portugal, they've done something that really they could only do in Portugal with their system. They've taken it out of the criminal justice system and even a civil system that they have, and they've put it into an equivalent system that we don't have here, which essentially means if you have a small amount of any drug on you, you go to a 3-person panel, and that 3-person social work panel essentially says you should get a fine, you should go to treatment, nothing if unless you come back again, then we're going to mandate you to go to treatment, or we're going to, you know, whatever. And they look at the totality of the circumstances. What they've seen as a result of that change, they never arrested people and put them in jail before that policy was in place. They never did that. In fact, they're actually citing more people now since that policy's been in place. So that's interesting. But what has basically happened is, also around that time, drug-related deaths have gone down. Youth use, and this happened since, I'm not going to fault Glenn Greenwald for it, it happened since his report, but youth use has gone up, actually, depending on, you know, when you look at annual use among students, according to the European SPAD study, which is the most prominent and well-known European survey on drugs throughout the continent. Drug use has gone up, deaths and HIV, I believe, have gone down. At the same time, they implemented a massive expansion of treatment. So at the same time as this sort of new strange thing that they did, law and referral, they implemented massive treatment. I really don't think we can get a lot from looking at what's happened. I think, you know, I know it's something like, for example, Bill O'Reilly and other people have tried to. I don't know how much we can learn from it either way, other than to say youth use is up because there's a perception, I think, that maybe it is legal. The reality is it's not legal. And it's treated in a way that I think oftentimes we treat low-level users here. What do we do with low-level users oftentimes? We give them a diversion. They don't go straight to prison. They actually, if it's your first, second time, you go to a diversion. You sometimes go to a drug court. We certainly need more of those. Or you get a brief assessment that decides whether you need, you know, what kind of intervention you need. So I think it's just a country that has gone an interesting way. They get very offended, the Portuguese officials, when you imply that they've legalized drugs. I mean, we went there. They said absolutely not. There is this weird, strange perception that we've done something radical. All we did was, rather than arrest you and do nothing with you before, rather than that, which is what they used to do, they've not arrested you, they've cited you and taken you to this 3-person panel and then figured out what to do, and they've massively expanded treatment. So,
Of course, a good place to start learning about Portugal's experiment is in the 11 pages in Kevin's book, Myth Number 6. It's a great starting point with a lot of great references. Kevin's book is available on Amazon.com. This program will be available within 24 hours on the Heritage website. And please join me in thanking Kevin for his excellent presentation.